I'm Dean, I'm the dad.
I'm Laura, I'm the mom.
And I'm Krysta, I'm the daughter.
And together we are Family Plot. Now that was nice. How is everybody today?
It was nice, except for Krysta wasn't part of the family plot at the end. But that's...
You weren't part? Yeah, of course she's part. Nah, you. Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Well, we're recording this the night before, but this will go out Thanksgiving, so...
This is our Thanksgiving episode.
Yes.
And we are thankful for our listeners.
Yes.
We're thankful for one another.
Very
Yes.
thankful.
Thankful for the rest of our family.
We're thankful that a little incident that Krysta had at school this week wasn't worse.
Yep.
Because we love our Krysta and we worry about her.
And we're thankful for Noelle's poop compartment.
I'm
Dad!
not thankful for Noel's poop compartment.
We don't talk about this. Okay, move
Right out
on.
there with Bruno. We got to move on.
We don't talk about Bruno or Noel's poop compartment.
There's no such thing as a poop compartment.
There's no such thing as a poop compartment.
All right.
Really weird.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. That's for one thing.
Sure.
Always happy to have listeners.
We appreciate our listeners. We appreciate the fact that we've once again been recognized on Good Pause charts.
Yep. That's, yeah. Well, so, that was good. Last week's episode was a hit, apparently. People liked it, which, yay, me, I'm happy about that.
I don't talk much.
Hey, remember, if you want to help out the show, a few ways you can do that. There's Patreon, which is monthly donations. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a one-time thing. The easiest way, of course, is to share the show on social media. Now, as we always say, if you enjoy the show, please share it. If you don't enjoy the show, keep that to yourself.
Absolutely.
Yep. So, what are we talking about? Well, tonight, thanks to the fact that we did an episode on time travel and learned how, we head back to the 1800s to meet a man from a family of great actors. A man who sympathized with the plight of the South in the last days of the American Civil War. So much so, he initially resolved to kidnap the president. However, he and his circle of conspirators instead chose to assassinate the president instead, along with the vice president and the Secretary of State. Now, that didn't quite work out the way they planned it, but today he stands disrespected by most as the assassin of Lincoln. Tonight we discuss John Wilkes Booth. And so I'm kind of thankful for John Wilkes Booth, because this is kind of an interesting episode. It was a lot of...
I don't know that I'm thankful for John Wilkes Booth, but I guess that is part of our country's history.
Yes. Well, but first, before we go on a tear about Booth, Krysta has some facts, or rather this week, their stories.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Fact Corner. I'm sorry I wasn't here last week. Oh, so sad.
It wasn't sad because we had our check-in with Krysta last week. Which
Well,
was awesome.
We did. We may have, but not as good as facts in my opinion. Don't question me. I'm having issues.
Okay.
Who questioned you? Are you hearing someone talk to you that I'm not?
Yes, right here, in my headphone.
Okay, well, we may have to take you to a
Audiologist.
or a mental health facility.
No, honey, that's where we belong.
Oh, okay.
Oh, jeez.
I'm killing the child. That wasn't the intended.
You're gonna kill me.
Intended action there. Sorry, babe.
You'd be fine, but
That's okay. He can edit out the long pauses. That's not a problem.
Yeah, I do that pretty well. I can edit this out tomorrow while your mom is making your brothers make Thanksgiving dinner.
So we are going to have your mom's cinnamon apples.
Ooh, that'll be good.
We're going to have homemade stuffing. We're going to have turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole,
That you just melt down the candy and
pumpkin pie. Your grandma literally taught you all how to do it. You stood there in her kitchen and she taught
I
you.
have bad brain.
That's why you
I know
get,
if I
that's why
ask
you
either
get
of the
a
other
homemade-
two, I know if I ask either of the other two, they won't know either because
Okay.
you know I was the only one.
Baby, it's okay. Hey, breathe.
That's okay.
So,
You-
hey, why don't you give us the intro to the John Wilkes Booth, and then we can come back to Krista's stories when she's found them.
Okay.
We change things up a little bit. It's Thanksgiving. We can party for the holiday.
Well, what better intro can I give than his arrival into the United States?
Did he come from somewhere else?
Well, he didn't, but his family did.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a little different, but yeah, go ahead.
He was born to Junius Brutus Booth, who was a noted British Shakespearean actor.
That is quite the name.
Yes. And his mistress, Mary Ann Holmes.
Mistress?
Yes.
Cool. Where
So
did they come from?
they came from somewhere in England. They moved to Bel Air, Maryland in 1821. And
It was okay for them to be a man and his mistress? Because I was kind of under the impression that they were a little funky about stuff like that back in the 1800s.
well, in England, they probably weren't real cool with it. In fact, they almost definitely weren't. But America was a bit more forgiving at the time. In fact, there's a play called Our American Cousin that actually sort of figures into Booth's life. But anyway, it sort of figures into Booth's life, but it sort of shows the way that the differences in that play between the English and the Americans at the time.
Okay.
So
our American cousin would maybe help illustrate for me the way of things
right. So
a little more.
right. Now they moved over here in 1821. But John Wilkes Booth was not born until May 10th, 1838.
Okay, so a minute.
Yeah, it took them a while. Well, he was the 9th of 10 kids.
That must have been a really good mistress. Was she still the mistress when he was born, or did
Yes.
they finally get married?
No. She
remained the mistress.
remained.
So he had a wife back in England?
Yes, he did.
Ah. So he was truly continental at the time.
Yep. Well, his wife back in England, her
On
name
the playing field, jeez.
was Adelaide Delanoy Booth.
Fabulous.
And she was finally granted a divorce based on infidelity in 1851.
After the 10 kids.
Yes.
Fine. It took 10 for the judges to say, you know what, you're right.
No, I don't know if the judges in England knew what was going on.
I can't. Okay.
Why don't they keep track records on the I'm done?
Because it's the Civil War. It's not like they had the internet or even phones.
Yeah, no, there wasn't like there wasn't any documentation of this sort of nonsense back then, for sure.
You cannot sit here and tell me that. Because I know there might as well have been spies who were watching people. keep track of what they were doing or what they were...
Okay, but you're talking about it literally took months to get from one country across the ocean to the other country. It took them months to get from one area to the other. It was literally like an entire season to go from one place to the other.
I'm trying not to go mentally insane, but I am!
No, but I'm just saying, so that's why, like correspondence between the two was
I
just
hate
ridiculous.
correspondence. It's awful. I'm done.
You could pick up the phone and call.
Ah!
So now Booth was named after English radical politician John Wilkes.
I thought you were going to say Ratatouille. That's fine.
John Wilkes was a distant relative of the family.
Okay.
And thus on May 10th, 1851, John's 13th birthday, his parents were married.
Finally!
His birthday is one day after
On the lucky 13th birthday. Wow.
Isn't 13 an odd number?
Yes.
It is.
And he was born in a 4-room log house, like a bigger version of a log cabin.
Right.
Now, eventually they built an actual hall, but he was born while they still were living in a log structure.
He was born one day after Lexi. Well, yeah. His birthday is one day after Lexi.
Yes, his birthday is one day after Lexi's, although he was technically born about, not quite, but almost 200 years before she was. But yeah, I pointed out to your mom that his birthday is the day after our little Lexi's. Are you ready, Krysta? Yes. Okay, well, let's try this again.
Okay, sorry. Today's facts. Stories. I'm done. I'm tired. Okay. Today's stories are from listverse.com. This is by John Munoz.
M-U-N-O-Z? Munoz, usually.
I'm done. I'm sorry for butchering your name, blah, blah, blah.
All good.
I don't think you butchered it. I just was helping.
Krista, do you need help?
No.
Yeah.
This first one is called The Taste of Brains.
Ew.
Yeah.
Gross.
Yeah. Real quick disclaimer, because I do not want people getting triggered and blaming on us. And don't tell me I didn't tell you so. This is a real quick trigger warning. There might be gore and other stuff.
The Taste of Brains pretty much guarantees a little bit of gore. Just saying.
And the Civil War pretty much guarantees a little bit of gore.
Well, it's like Dan Cummins when he's talking about that time period. He was like doctoring at that point was whiskey, laudanum, saw.
Pretty much.
Sounds like you're shouting a bunch of insults at me. Anyway, it was common for literate soldiers to write diaries during their deployment, whether as personal journals or meant as letters to loved ones. Henry Fitzgerald Charles kept one, and it chronicles his service to the Union as part of the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry.
Cavalry.
He was involved in many conflicts over his 3 stints war. Certainly, he saw his share of the war stories, only one stands out. He writes about one day when he and another soldier entered the woods after a battle had ended there, looking for salvage. They rested, and all at once I heard a gun crack. At the same time, my mouth was filled with another man's brain. There was a sharpshooter in the distant woods somewhere. I reckon he waited till he had both in line and was going to kill two birds with one stone. But my friend's head was too hard. It reflected the bullet. If I swallowed any of it, it certainly came up along with everything else I had in my stomach. A bullet bit for both men was stopped by his friend's skull, and Charles had a taste of his friend's brain.
Wow.
So his friend got shot by someone further in the woods, and he had gotten it because he regurgitated it. Yeah.
That may be the grossest thing that I've ever heard on this show.
That
Yeah.
is right up there for
Yeah.
sure. Absolutely.
And the Union is the North. The Confederacy is the South.
Right.
Story number 2. The Devil's Den, Gettysburg. The Devil's Den is a rocky hill in Pennsylvania. It was named for its twisting passages that seem to cut through its many large boulders, thought to be made by a giant serpent. The biblical devil. Yeah. The small hill is home to an impressive amount of ghost stories and purported sightings. For one, the whole hill seems to become a dead zone for electronics at random intervals. Visitors have claimed to see uniformed Union soldiers walking through it, even one with a bloody chest wound who asked passers-by for help. If ghosts are real, then Devil's Den would be a natural haunt. The hill was a battleground on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the single bloodiest battle in the entire Civil War, which is the single bloodiest conflict in American history.
Yeah, we talked about Devil's Den when we talked about Gettysburg.
Yeah, we did.
In fact,
That's just going a little bit more into depth about it.
Right. In fact, a common thing that happens there is people think that there's Civil War reenactors and they'll ask them for directions and then they'll vanish. And a lot of people think that's the ghost of a Civil War soldier.
Story number 3, Angel's Flow. This story concludes in a very wholesome way by imagining how soldiers in the war experienced it. It must have been frightening. There are multiple reports from the war that soldiers' injuries would sometimes begin mysteriously go glowing blue. Most famously, those at Battle of Shiloh. The otherworldly light came to be known as Angel's Glow. The glow was written off as superstition for a century and a half until a 17-year-old whose mother studied bioluminescent bacteria learned of Angel's Glow and put 2 and 2 together. He and a friend conducted some experiments and were able to unravel the whole mystery. It turns out the heavenly flight of the angels was caused by bacterium
Photosynthesis.
No, photorhabdus?
Yeah, I'm not familiar, but cool.
Luminescent.
Luminescence.
Yeah, luminescent.
Phosphorescence. Let me see.
Habdus. Literally.
We'll figure out what that word is.
Okay, I can spell it out for you.
Okay, if you can spell it, Dad'll probably know what it is.
Photorhabdus.
Photorhabdus? I've never heard of it, but could be the name of a bacterium. They have names just like animals do, even though...
Yeah.
We're just gonna call it... Can I call it BPL? Would that be bad?
Go ahead. I'll give you permission.
Caused by the BPL.
Sure.
That's all we're gonna call it right now.
Sounds good.
Though to soldiers at time who knew nothing of microbiology, this must have been an unearthly experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it was terrifying.
Green eyes. Video.
Wow.
Green eyes are talking about. A monster story that comes from Civil War soldiers themselves is that of old green eyes. It is a supernatural creature that haunts the site of Battle
Chickamauga. Big battle there. Maybe at least one.
And Georgia. The creature itself varies between tellings and sometimes a giant white ghoul. Sometimes a green-skinned swamp creature with fangs, and sometimes a headless soldier searching for the lost head. The one thing that every vision shares are bright, glowing green eyes. Yes, even the headless soldier somehow. It's no surprise that the area is haunted, with over 34,000 soldiers died on that spot.
Wow.
Within just 3 days.
If that's a few.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that is there. But, if I walked into that in the middle of the night, I would not be happy. I would be scared.
For sure.
Well, I might butcher this, but I've butchered a lot of things already, so I apologize.
That's okay.
The Dream of John C. Calhoun?
Calhoun. Yeah.
John Calhoun was an American politician, most famous for serving as vice president to both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson.
Cool.
He was called the Cast Iron Man for his unwavering, absolute support of Southern customs and beliefs, including slavery and white supremacy.
Okay, well,
One night, a few
whatever.
years before the war, Calhoun was preparing a plan for the South to leave the Union when he was visited in a dream. He said, "The sight struck me like a thunderclap. It was the face of dead men whom extraordinary events had called back to life. The features were those of George Washington, and he was dressed in his general uniform. Washington then placed a black spot on Calhoun's right hand, which said, 'Washington is the mark by which Benedict Arnold is known in the next world.' Washington warned Calhoun that dissolving the Union would be traitorous, and would haunt him throughout his eternal afterlife.
For sure. Stories, Crystal, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Krysta. Those were great. You did good. So as we left our young John, he had just turned 13 and his parents were married. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about are going to go back and forth over this time because an event is coming up that's going to change John pretty drastically forever.
Civil War?
No.
Oh.
As a boy, young John was both athletic and popular. He excelled in horse riding and fencing. He attended the Bel Air Academy, where he was considered fairly intelligent, but the headmaster of the academy said he was unwilling to partake in the educational opportunities offered to him, and he claims he rode back and forth to school more interested in the observations on the rides to and from than he was in getting to school on time. After that, he attended the Milton Boarding School for Boys, which was located in Sparks, Maryland. There, he and other students recited classic works by authors like Cicero, Herodotus, and Tacitus. Now, it was during this time he met a Romani fortune teller, and the Romani were a nomadic group of people from India originally, but they traveled through Europe where they were often considered heretics and thieves. They were dubbed gypsies by the locals back then, but really in the 70s, the Romani got together. There was like a worldwide summit of them, and they decided to forego any name given to them by anyone but themselves.
I see.
So they prefer to be referred to as the Romani.
I see.
But we will actually do an episode on the Romani because Laura asked me to.
I think that their history is curious. They've certainly hit those marks of being something of fairy tales and historical mystery, and
they are fascinating. They are. But one of the common things with the Romani is fortune telling. And a Romani fortune teller read his palm. She proclaimed that he would have a grand but short life, doomed to die young, and he would meet a bad end. He wrote this prediction down, discussing it with friends and family, especially in moments of melancholy and sadness. Now, after he spent a year at the Milton Boarding School, he attended St. Timothy's Hall, an Episcopal military school in Cantonsville, Maryland, where he wore a military-style uniform, engaged in daily formation drills, and was urged to strict discipline by his teachers. Now, at the age of 14, he left the Milton Boarding School for Boys because his father had passed away.
Wow, that's really, really, really rough. Weird.
I was gonna say rough. What's weird? The dad dying?
Apparently, having a wife was not good for him. Well, yeah, because he made 10 babies, had a wife and a mistress.
What the hell?
Made 10 babies. Raised the second to the youngest to 13 years old. And was doing great. Marries the mistress? 1 year later, dead as a doornail. What?
I think that mistress found out about his wife.
The mistress knew about his wife. That's why
The wife found out about his mistress and killed him.
His wife lived in England and had been divorced from him.
Okay,
So,
listen. Does the door know? Do they randomly just, the wife may have been all the way in England, but did we track that down? did science tell us, oh, she stayed there. She stayed in England.
I'm just saying, married life must not have been too good to him. First, he takes his mistress and goes to the other side of the ocean to get away from one marriage. Then the mistress finally wears him down after, 20 years? Gets him to marry her, and then...
he died.
In 12 months, he's gone.
It could be more. They married on...
The 13th birthday, and, maybe up to 18 or 24 months at the extreme end.
But yes, within a year or two.
In other words, married life just was not for this dude.
Well, that may be true. He was a great actor. He was surrounded by actors. Most of his children became actors or actresses because he had female children as well.
I see.
And it was shortly after his father's death that Booth decided he wanted to be an actor like his father and his brother and began to practice elocution, and he began to study Shakespeare. He made his acting debut at 17, playing the Earl of Richmond in Shakespeare's Richard III. He was jeered by the crowd for forgetting some of his lines in that performance.
Uh-oh.
That's right.
Now, right around that same time, Booth also began to act at Baltimore's Holiday Street Theater, where the Booth family had performed regularly. The following year, he became a member of the stock company of the Arch Street Theater in Philadelphia. He had become quite the scene stealer by this point, but he played his characters with such enthusiasm and vigor that audiences idolized him.
Aw. Well, that's good, I think.
He became a stock company actor at the Richmond Theater in Virginia, where his energetic performances earned him the regular praise of the crowd. Sometime afterwards, he played Horatio in the play Hamlet, where his brother Edwin played the role of Hamlet.
Well,
Now, after the show, Edwin brought his brother to the footlights, which is right down front, at the front of the stage, and he addressed the crowd, asking them if they enjoyed John's performance as much as he did. To quote Monty Python, there was much rejoicing. The crowd really gave him a big, big applause. And now we're going to take time for a word from our sponsors.
word from our sponsors.
Yes, I'm sure we'll have some, even if it is Thanksgiving.
Maybe.
Yes. Now, Booth's favorite Shakespearean character to play was Brutus, famed for slaying... Et Brute. Famed for slaying the tyrant Caesar. Now, as the 1850s began to draw to a close, he was becoming wealthy as an actor, making around $20,000 a year.
Wow.
And that's over $600,000 in today's money.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
Yes. So he embarked on his first national tour as a leading actor shortly thereafter. He hired Philadelphia attorney Matthew Canning to serve as his agent.
Okay.
On April 12th, 1861, when the Civil War began, he publicly dubbed the South's secession from the Union as heroic. Now, at this point, it was around this point that Ford, the guy that had owned the playhouse that the Booths performed at so often near his home, opened a new theater in Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater.
That's the one.
Now,
The plot thickens, as they say.
and the very first play they put up was a play called The Marble Heart, where John Wilkes Booth played a sculptor whose works came to life. And Lincoln was in attendance for this play, and as he delivered a line, he gestured at Lincoln as he did so. Now, Lincoln's sister-in-law at that point was like, oh, hey, he pointed at you. I bet you he meant that line for you. And Lincoln's response was, he does look rather sharp at me, doesn't he? Meaning he's giving me kind of a dirty look. Now, also in young Tad Lincoln loved John Wilkes Booth. Thought he was a great actor. And in fact, the actor gave the boy a rose. And when he did, Lincoln's like, feel free to come back and meet me in between acts. John Wilkes Booth passed on that. In early 1863, John Wilkes Booth was arrested in St. Louis after he was heard stating he wished the president and the whole damned government would go to hell. He was arrested for making treasonous statements and had to pledge an oath to the Union and pay a very large fine. Might have been a problem for other people, but for him at that particular point in time, not at all. Now, as it became increasingly obvious that the North was winning the war, John became more and more hateful towards Lincoln and the North.
Why?
Because he was a Southerner.
Well,
And he was devout
Darn
to the
Confederacy
Southern
and
ideas.
Union. Why do y'all have to be so disrespectful to each other?
Here's the thing. Actually, he was not born in the South, but he did strongly sympathize with them, like a lot of people in Virginia did. And at this point, he was beginning to start to move south. Now, most of his family refused to perform in the South, especially once it became Confederate. John Wilkes kind of went the other way. In fact, later, and I didn't write this down, so I'm not exactly sure when, but later, Edwin and John would argue so much over the politics of the North and South that Edwin told John he was no longer welcome at his home. So really, it's splitting up the family, too.
Well, brother against brother. That was kind of the whole ideal behind the Civil War in general. That's kind of how it was for a lot of families, not just theirs. So.
Now, John Wilkes around this time began to consider the idea of kidnapping Lincoln from the old soldiers' home, where he stayed for the summer. Lincoln stayed for the summer, I should point out. It was about 3 miles from the White House, but it was close enough that Booth felt like he could smuggle him across the Potomac into Richmond, Virginia. And if he got to Virginia, he could trade him off to the Confederate leaders. And then the North would have to perhaps recognize the South as an equal country as opposed as... So, I mean, that was his thought. Was like he, in one stroke, could win the war. Now, he really shouldn't have been doing this because his mother, Wilkes' own mother, asked him never to become a soldier. But this would cause problems for Booth later on. John began to get more and more upset with Lincoln in the North. He began to appear in Confederate circles, and it seems, according to historian David Herbert Donald, at least at the lower levels of the Confederate spy game, the kidnap of Lincoln was being considered. In fact, at one point, for reasons nobody was sure of at the time, John Wilkes Booth just left and went to Montreal for about a week. Now, Montreal is where the Confederate spy masters hung out because it was another country, so they could get away with it, you know? So a lot of people think that at this point, Booth joined the spy game.
Sure. I mean, and that kind of makes sense with everything that happened with him afterwards, so...
Also, whenever he would perform in the South, he would smuggle quinine. I'm not exactly sure. Quinine? Quinini. quinine, which is a treatment for malaria. It was actually one of the earliest ones. And the South didn't have a lot of it. And they had a lot more malaria than the North. But the North had blockaded the South and wasn't letting any medicine get through. So John would smuggle some with him anytime he'd head to the South. He also assembled a loose band of Confederate sympathizers, including David Harold, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and Lewis Powell, sometimes known as Lewis Payne, and John Surratt, and they would meet upstairs at John's mother's, Mary Surratt's boarding house.
I was going to say, Surratt sounds very familiar.
Yeah, John Surratt and Mary Surratt. There. And Mary Surratt actually has the unfortunate distinction of being the first woman to be hanged in the U.S. for a crime.
Ah, see. See, I thought it sounded familiar.
Now, on March 17th, 1865, shortly after Lincoln's landslide re-election, which he ran on the platform of abolishing slavery, which is what got him the vote. Now, remember, the southern states aren't voting here. They got their own system. This is all the North. So,
Well, there you go.
now, at that time, Booth would have his letters, a lot of his mail delivered to Ford's Theater. So at that time, on March 17th, he goes to Ford's Theater to collect his mail, and he overhears that that Lincoln was going to be attending a play at a hospital near the soldiers' home. The conspirators gathered to capture him, right? But Lincoln never appeared. Booth later found out that Lincoln had changed his mind and decided to attend a reception at the National Hotel in Washington at the last minute. The funny part is the hotel where Booth was staying at that time was the National Hotel in Washington.
I see.
So, and there's a lot of this sort of coincidental,
All kind of situations.
yeah, like this almost nearly crossing paths with each other a lot and just never quite working out.
Yeah.
So now the White House was very different back then. People would just sort of gather. There wasn't a fence, I don't think, or if there was, it was open quite a lot of the time. And so at one point, Lincoln sees there's quite a crowd gathered on the lawn of the White House, and he just sort of impromptu addresses them.
Gotcha.
And so, and Lincoln said during the speech he was in favor of giving suffrage to the former slaves.
Uh-huh. And that basically means that
He'd give them the right to vote.
give them, yeah.
He'd make them full citizens. Upon hearing this, Booth decided it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever make. The next morning, he went to Ford's Theater again to get his mail, and this time he heard that Lincoln and Grant would be attending the play My American Cousin that evening. He saw a chance. He gathered with his Confederates, assigning Powell to assassinate William H. Seward, the Secretary of State, and he assigned Atzerodt to assassinate Vice President Johnson. Booth then went to the Ford Theater, where General Grant was not on hand. His wife insisted that Grant go to visit family in New Jersey, and Grant, pretty much whenever it didn't involve military matters, listened to his wife. So he left for New Jersey. Instead, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, had joined the president and his wife at the play. Rathbone, yes.
Did you just say Rathbone?
Yeah.
Rathbone, Rathbone, yes.
That's what he said.
That is a very interesting last name.
It is
There-
indeed.
Well, there's an actor in the 1940s named Basil Rathbone. Spelled the same way. I wonder if they're related, but I don't know. I've never checked into it. Now, Booth entered the president's box at 10:14 p.m. A few minutes later, he shot the president in the back of the head with a .41 caliber Derringer, stabbed Major Rathbone, who attempted to stop him, and leapt from the box to the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." Now, according to some papers, it was also reported that he said, "I have done it, the South is avenged," afterwards. Now, there are some people who will argue that what he did here was a stupid move, that if he had just moved back the way he came, he could have gotten away without so much as being spotted. But those people ignore who the heck Booth was. Booth was an actor who was very energetic and very physical, and that's why people liked him. He was known for bringing energy and spirit to these roles that he played. And so for him to do something like kill a person that he considered to be a tyrant and not take immediate credit for it on the stage, which he considered a second home, was inevitable. It's who he was. There was no way he was going to shoot Lincoln and then scoot out the back.
Right.
Now, Lincoln did not die right away. He died the next morning.
So they just let him
No, they took him to a hotel, a nearby hotel, and put him in a room to try to do what they could, but he was shot in the back of the head. That's a tough wound to do anything with now.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was shot in the back of the head. I mean, what did I expect?
Yeah.
You know, it was probably a whole lot tougher to deal with in the days of, and again, to quote Dan Cummins, whiskey laudanum saw. So, once he shot Lincoln, that was Wilkes Booth part in the plot, okay? But we have to deal with his co-conspirators. Now, as I said, he put Lewis Powell on William Seward. Now, Powell went to Seward's home and found him recovering from a carriage accident. And so he went in and he stabbed Seward a whole lot of times and ran away. Now, Seward would recover. Johnson, the vice president, Atzerodt was sent to kill him. Now, Atzerodt found out where Johnson was, and then he went downstairs and he began to drink. And then he decided to leave the hotel and wander through the city. And then he stopped at a few more places and got some more drinks. Long story short, his nerve broke. He never attempted to assassinate Johnson.
Right.
So the only successful member of this group was Booth. Now, there is something we need to talk about here, because as Booth leapt from the box to the stage, there are those who say he caught his spur on a flag, he landed badly, and broke his leg or his ankle.
I see.
When he hit the stage. But there are those who say he left the stage and the theater so quickly he could not have injured himself that way at that time. And it is interesting to note that he told Samuel Mudd, the doctor he visits later to get the leg set, that he broke his leg when his horse fell on top of him. So I'm not sure which way it goes, but because to me, I can see it both ways. He had just killed Lincoln, which was something he'd been wanting to do for a while. He'd succeeded in his goals. He'd just gotten on stage. There is a thing called stage health. I have used it when you're sick as a dog, but you have to perform. You basically take all the medicine you can, you step on stage, and something about that moment will carry you through for a while. So it's possible when he hit the stage, he wasn't feeling any pain and really didn't feel it until he got down the road a ways. Now, Booth fled out the back of the theater, climbed on a waiting horse, and rode for Surratt's Tavern on the Brandywine Pike, 9 miles from Washington, D.C. He met David Harold there and gathered weapons and supplies that they had stored there as part of their plot to kidnap the president. Afterwards, they rode another 16 miles to the house of Dr. Samuel Mudd to get him to treat Booth's leg. The next day, Booth and Harold arrived at the home of Samuel Cox, who had them hide in a nearby wood as he contacted his foster brother, Thomas Jones, a man who had been spying for the Confederacy for some time. Meanwhile, the federal troops were combing through Maryland and searching for Booth and his co-conspirators. A nation mourned the loss of its president, and people came from all over. They slept on hotel floors. They slept on the White House lawn to see the body lying in state. And then it got put on a train where it would slowly travel from town to town on its way to Springfield, Illinois. It's Lincoln's final resting place. Right. And if it was during the day, the train would stop, people would come on board, follow past. But at night, even the conductor was talking about how surreal it was. They would drive past like stations that they didn't stop at night and just see townspeople gathered with torches. And it was just surreal to see all these just really
grieving the president.
Yeah. So this was not a great time for Americans.
Right.
Now, around this point, Harold and Booth were provided with a boat and a compass to cross the Potomac, but somehow they wound up back in Maryland. And I'm not sure how because at this point there were gunboats on the Potomac because they were being looked for on the Potomac. So I don't know if they saw a boat coming and tried to get around it and thought they'd cross when they didn't. It's certain that the place they came back was a bend in the river, so they might have thought the bend was that they'd made the crossing. They hadn't. Anyway, as they get out, David Harold realizes they're not across the Potomac.
Right.
But he does realize it's a place he knows well. He hunted there growing up. So he leads them to another Confederate synthesizer, John J. Hughes' farm, where he gave them food and a hideout until they could attempt to cross the Potomac into Virginia once more. Booth wrote in his diary at this time, "With every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, I am looked on as a common cutthroat." And that kind of bothers me because I get that he's an actor. I get he liked playing Brutus, but what, did he think people were going to stand up and cheer for the death of Lincoln?
Well, I mean, it was a different time though, and like the people who were dedicated to their ideals were really dedicated to their ideals. And they were willing to fight and bleed and die for those ideals. And even though Booth had a different idea of what he thought was right, I mean, there were other people who were radically on his side as well. This was a very serious debate to these people, and they felt, I mean, no one has the right to own anyone. We know that now for sure. But at that time, there were people who felt that they had that right. And while they were wrong, and I can honestly say that, no one has the right to own me or anyone else of any color. I don't care if you're purple polka dot. It doesn't matter what your color is. No one has the right to own you. But they didn't get that, and they were radical in their ideals.
Oh,
So
I know.
I can see where, I mean, it's the same as someone who may be mentally ill and are very convinced and dedicated to whatever ideal that they have. You're not going to convince them of otherwise, and they see it as they're doing what they genuinely are convinced is right, and they feel like other people will support them in that.
I get that. I guess I just don't understand being whiny after you, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare, screwed your courage to the sticking point to commit an assassination, and yet people are like, well, he's a jerk. Yeah, you got to expect that. You're an assassin now. So, yeah, he was not doing well emotionally at this point. Eventually, they cross the Potomac into Virginia. They make it to the Garrett's farmhouse. And the Garrett farmhouse, the Garretts put them up in their tobacco barn, which I don't know what it is about tobacco barns. There's plenty here in Missouri, and every one I've ever seen looks like it's about to fall down. I swear they build them that way. I wouldn't be happy to be sent to a tobacco barn for nothing, but that's where they send them. Well, about this point is when the Union troops begin to catch up with them. And the federal troops catch on to them at this point, and they basically tell them to surrender and come on out. Now, David Harold does surrender and leave the barn. Booth responds with, I'd prefer to come out and fight. So they're like, okay, you want to leave? That's fine. They set the barn on fire.
Sure. Like you do.
Like you do. Now, a Union soldier named Boston Corbett sees Booth. He claims raising his pistol like he's going to fire at them. And so he fires at Booth. And he hits him in the neck. Well, they rush in. They pull Booth out. They bring him to the Garrett's porch. And people are very mad at Boston Corbett for firing that bullet, by the way. Now, 3 hours later, Booth is on the porch. He utters his final words, which were, "Tell my mother I died for my country." And then he asks someone to hold up his hand so he can see them, because the shot to the neck paralyzed him from the neck down. He could not move.
Yeah.
So he asks them to hold up his hands where he can see them, and he says, "Useless, useless." And then he dies. Now, the damaged vertebrae from his neck was removed during the autopsy because they had to remove it to get to the bullet. So they removed that and a couple of others, and those are all preserved and on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C.
There you go.
He was identified through a tattoo reading JWB on the back of his hand and a scar on the back of his neck. About 10 people that knew Booth saw him and identified him. People that had grown up with him saw him and identified him. So,
Or it was definitely him.
yeah. Now, 8 others involved in the plot were tried by military tribunal. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold were hanged at Old Arsenal Prison on July 7th, 1865. Michael O'Laughlin was sentenced to life in prison at Fort Jefferson in Florida's Dry Tortugas, where he died of yellow fever in 1867. Everyone else was also put in the Fort Jefferson penitentiary, but they were all also pardoned by Andrew Johnson in 1869. Yeah. So really, they didn't spend more than 4 years in prison, most of them. Now, the death of the other 4 conspirators, especially Mary Surratt, there is a bit of a lingering, we really shouldn't have done that, but people wanted blood. Lincoln had been killed, and there wasn't a Lincoln around to go, no, we can't just go blood for blood.
Right.
And Lincoln was kind of unusual in that. He wanted to welcome the Confederates back as friends and family.
Yeah.
That was his big thing. A lot of people didn't. A lot of people wanted to punish them for succeeding from the Union.
Sure.
And because of that, Reconstruction to this day is hotly argued by historical scholars as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. The one thing everybody does seem to agree on is if Lincoln had somehow survived, it would have been much better. But there wasn't that cool head around. And so, yeah, people wanted...
encourage that.
Yeah, so people wanted bodies. They got bodies.
Right.
And that is the story of John Wilkes Booth.
Well, how about that?
Now, there is some conspiratorial aftermath.
Yeah, because there were talks that... and of course this always happens with any kind of major news story. And especially, we talked about the fact that times were so much different than... News moved so much slower, travel was slower, word was slower, word of mouth was as prevalent as actual official newspaper stories. And so the fact that, people said, oh, well, no, there may have been some conspiracy that he didn't actually die, that he was able to... that he smuggled away and it was somebody else. And
well, in 1907, Finis L. Bates wrote a book called The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, a book where he explained a Booth lookalike had been killed on the Garrett farm and that Booth had escaped to Texas, where he lived under the assumed name John St. Helen. Some years later, he got quite sick and confessed on what he thought was going to be his deathbed that he was, in fact, Booth. Getting better, he fled to Oklahoma before committing suicide in 1903 in Enid, Oklahoma, using the pseudonym David E. George. Now, Finis went on to sell more than 70,000 copies of this book in 1903, and all while exhibiting the mummified body of St. Helen at a carnival sideshow. Now, this theory has been revived periodically, most recently in 1977 for the book The Lincoln Conspiracy, where the same story was again presented, this time with the twist that the government knew that Booth had escaped, and they chose to call Booth dead because they felt like it would pull his fangs. But see, this doesn't make any sense to me. Booth is an actor and a pretty darn famous one. The Booths were like if the Baldwins lived in the States and Stephen Baldwin killed Trump or Biden or, any president. People know who Stephen Baldwin is. Now, true, not as many would have known Booth by sight as Baldwin, but a lot would have. He was a nationally touring actor. He was almost as famous as he could be in the day.
Right. Exactly. And that's what I'm saying. So especially like that, those are the kinds of things that pick up stories and catch people's imaginations, and it's still that same kind of the rumor mill. So...
but I did watch the movie The Lincoln Conspiracy today on YouTube. It is on there.
Not the best.
It's horse feathers. It's pure horse feathers. Great watch, but anything they say that isn't historically accurate, they don't provide any sort of proof for.
I see.
And you need proof for that kind of crap. You can't just go on a whim and say, oh, this happened. It's not a documentary anymore. It's your kind of imagination of what it should be like.
Right.
Of course.
So that is all I have for this week's show. Your thoughts, Krysta?
It was good.
Honestly, I don't really have anything to say. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory here. Two men rivalry. One was especially motivated to kill the other. The other had no idea about it. They both went to war with each other. One of them killed the other dude, and almost got away with it. But I feel like it's self-explanatory.
It is. Just, if you have any thoughts.
I don't have anything to add to it. I think we've kind of hit all the things, but, it makes me thankful that,
It makes me thankful that we don't live
I
in that time
don't
period.
think that anyone wants to assassinate me yet.
Well,
No one.
I am sure no one wants to assassinate you. Well, that's our show. Thanks for listening, as always. Thanks to our theme music man, Bill Barrett. Bill, and if you need music for a project, Bill's your guy. That's Bill Barrett, BEHRENDT, at sbcglobal.net. That'll reach him. Thanks to Paige Elmore, who, along with her and Krysta, did our logo art. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you, so beautiful.
Thanks to Aaron Gnerk of the Big Dumb Fun Show, who provides us with some local promotion. Thank you, Aaron. Join us next week for the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. Bye.
Bye.